He was driving home from a late-night community meeting at 11:47 p.m. on what seemed like an ordinary Thursday evening, taking the same route through downtown that he had traveled hundreds of times during his 22 years of police service, when the flashing red and blue lights appeared in his rearview mirror and changed everything about what should have been a routine drive home. What happened next would be recorded on dashboard cameras, body cameras, and cell phone videos that would be viewed by millions of people who couldn't believe they were watching two police officers systematically humiliate and threaten their own commanding officer, based solely on the color of his skin and their assumptions about who belonged in expensive cars in upscale neighborhoods. But officers Jake Sullivan and Tony Rodriguez had absolutely no idea that the black man they were about to pull from his BMW and treat like a dangerous criminal was actually Captain Marcus Williams, their direct supervisor, the man who signed their performance evaluation, and someone who could end both of their careers with a single disciplinary report that would be filed before they even finished their shift. The man behind the wheel of that BMW was Captain Marcus Williams, though neither Sullivan nor Rodriguez would bother to properly identify him before launching into the most racist and professionally destructive traffic stop of their combined 28 years in law enforcement. At 48 years old, Marcus carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone who had earned his position through 2 decades of exemplary service, someone who had worked his way up from patrol officer to detective to sergeant to lieutenant, and finally to captain, becoming the youngest African-American captain in the department's history and one of the most respected supervisors in the entire metropolitan area. He was driving home from a community policing meeting where he had spent 3 hours listening to residents' concerns about police-community relations, working on initiatives to build trust and improve communication between his officers and the neighborhoods they served. What officers Sullivan and Rodriguez couldn't have known as they followed Marcus's BMW through the financial district was that he wasn't just any successful professional driving an expensive car through their patrol area. Marcus Williams was not only their commanding officer, but also the architect of most of the community policing programs that had earned their department national recognition for progressive law enforcement practices. He had personally implemented the body camera program that was about to record their career-ending misconduct, the bias training seminars that they had both slept through, and the citizen complaint procedures that would soon be used to document their racist behavior in excruciating detail. Officer Jake Sullivan, 34 years old with 8 years on the force, had requested assignment to this particular patrol area because it allowed him to stop expensive cars and hassle what he called suspicious individuals who had the audacity to drive through neighborhoods where he didn't think they belonged. Sullivan had built his reputation on aggressive traffic enforcement and what he considered proactive policing, which mostly consisted of stopping well-dressed black professionals and subjecting them to humiliating searches based on nothing more than his assumptions about who could afford luxury vehicles and who was probably stealing them. His partner, Officer Tony Rodriguez, was a 10-year veteran who had learned to follow Sullivan's lead when it came to traffic stops, especially when they involved what Sullivan called high-value targets. Expensive cars driven by black men who obviously didn't belong in upscale areas. Rodriguez had never questioned Sullivan's methods or examined his own biases, and he certainly hadn't considered the possibility that some of the people they routinely harassed might actually have more authority and credibility than 2 patrol officers looking for easy arrests. The traffic stop began with Sullivan radioing in a suspicious vehicle report, describing Marcus's BMW as a high-end vehicle with a single black male occupant traveling through the financial district at an unusually late hour. The description was coded language that both officers understood meant they were about to make what they assumed would be an easy arrest for either stolen vehicle, drug possession, or outstanding warrants. Neither officer had bothered to run the license plate, which would have immediately identified the vehicle as registered to a police captain with a spotless driving record. Marcus saw the patrol car's lights in his mirror and immediately understood that he was about to become the victim of exactly the kind of racially motivated traffic stop that he had been trying to eliminate through his community policing initiative. 22 years of police experience had taught him to recognize the difference between legitimate traffic enforcement and fishing expeditions, based on racial profiling, and everything about this stop screamed harassment rather than legitimate law enforcement activity. As Marcus pulled his BMW to the curb in front of a well-lit office building, he made a decision that would ultimately expose the racist attitudes that still existed within his own department. Instead of immediately identifying himself as a police captain, he decided to see exactly how his officers treated citizens they assumed were criminals based solely on their race and the kind of car they drove. He wanted to document this encounter because he suspected that what was about to happen to him was probably happening to other black professionals every night, people who didn't have his rank or authority to fight back against discriminatory policing practices. Sullivan approached the driver's side window with the aggressive swagger of someone who believed he was about to make his quota for the month, while Rodriguez positioned himself at the passenger side, cutting off any potential escape routes and preparing to provide backup if their suspect tried to resist or flee. Both officers had their hands on their service weapons, treating a routine traffic stop as if they were approaching a violent criminal instead of a law-abiding citizen who happened to be driving while black. "License and registration," Sullivan demanded through the closed window, his tone making it clear that this was not a polite request but an order that expected immediate compliance. "And keep your hands where I can see them at all times." Marcus rolled down his window slowly, maintaining the kind of calm composure that had served him well during his years as a detective and supervisor. "Good evening, officers. May I ask why you stopped me tonight?" The question seemed to infuriate Sullivan, who interpreted Marcus's calm professionalism as arrogance and disrespect. "Sir, I'll ask the questions here. You were driving suspiciously through this area, and I need to verify that you have legal right to be operating this vehicle. Now, I need to see your license and registration immediately, and I need you to explain what you're doing in this neighborhood at this time of night." Marcus reached slowly for his wallet, moving deliberately to avoid giving either officer an excuse to escalate the situation further. As he retrieved his driver's license, he made mental notes about every aspect of the encounter, knowing that his experience was providing him with invaluable insight into how his officers treated citizens they presumed to be criminals. "I'm driving home from a meeting," Marcus said simply, handing his license to Sullivan. "I work in law enforcement, and I was attending a community policing conference downtown." Sullivan examined the license with the skepticism of someone who had already decided it was probably fake or stolen. The license clearly showed Marcus's name, address, and clean driving record, but Sullivan's biases prevented him from accepting the possibility that a black man driving an expensive car might be exactly what he claimed to be. "Law enforcement," Sullivan repeated mockingly. "What kind of law enforcement? Security guard? Bail bondsman? Because I can tell you right now that whatever story you're planning to tell us had better check out, because we're going to verify every detail of whatever excuse you think is going to get you out of there." Rodriguez stepped closer to the passenger window, peering into the car as if looking for evidence of criminal activity. "This is a pretty expensive car for someone in law enforcement," he said, "unless you're making a lot more money than regular cops, which makes me wonder where that money is really coming from." The implication was clear, and Marcus felt the familiar burn of being presumed guilty until proven innocent. Here he was, a decorated police captain with over 2 decades of service, being accused of financial crimes by officers who were supposed to be following his leadership and implementing his policies. "Officers," Marcus said, his voice remaining calm despite the increasing aggression of his subordinates, "I can assure you that my vehicle is legally registered and that I have every right to be driving in this area. If you'd like to run my license through your system, you'll find that I have no outstanding warrants, no criminal record, and a clean driving history." But Sullivan wasn't interested in facts that might contradict his assumption. "Sir, I'm going to need you to step out of the vehicle so we can conduct a proper search. We have reasonable suspicion that this vehicle may be stolen or that you may be involved in illegal activities based on your suspicious behavior and presence in this area." The demand was both illegal and humiliating, but Marcus understood that refusing would only give Sullivan an excuse to use force and escalate the situation into something that could become dangerous for everyone involved. He also realized that this encounter was providing him with exactly the kind of evidence he needed to document the discriminatory policing practices that he had been trying to address through training and policy changes. Marcus stepped out of his BMW slowly, keeping his hands visible and his movements non-threatening, despite the fact that he was being treated like a criminal by officers who reported directly to him. As Sullivan began patting him down, ostensibly looking for weapons but really demonstrating his power over someone he viewed as inferior, Marcus made a decision that would change everything. "Officer Sullivan," Marcus said quietly, "I want you to take a very close look at my driver's license and think about whether you've seen that name somewhere before." Sullivan glanced at the license again, but his biases and preconceptions prevented him from making the connection that should have been obvious. The name Marcus Williams meant nothing to him, despite the fact that it appeared on every departmental memo, policy update, and performance evaluation that crossed his desk. "Rodriguez," Marcus continued, "I want you to call this in to dispatch and ask them to run my identification through the system. But before you do that, I want both of you to understand that everything you've done tonight has been recorded on your body cameras, and there will be consequences for both of you based on how this situation develops from here." Rodriguez made the call, but instead of requesting a standard license check, he asked dispatch to verify whether Marcus Williams was really employed in law enforcement as he claimed. The response came back within minutes, and Rodriguez's face went completely white as the dispatcher's voice crackled through the radio. "That's Captain Marcus Williams, badge number 1847, district commander for your precinct. He's your direct supervisor and has been on the force for 22 years with commendations for community policing and departmental leadership." The silence that followed was so complete that Marcus could hear traffic passing several blocks away and the distant sound of a police helicopter circling the downtown area. Sullivan stared at his own captain as if he were looking at a ghost, while Rodriguez stepped backward involuntarily, as if distance might somehow lessen the magnitude of their mistake. You're Captain Williams?" Sullivan stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. "I am," Marcus confirmed. "And officers, everything you've done in the past 15 minutes has been a violation of department policy, constitutional law, and basic human decency. You pulled me over without probable cause, subjected me to an illegal search, and made accusations about criminal activity based solely on my race and your assumptions about who belongs in expensive cars." Rehook. But what Captain Marcus Williams was about to do next would transform this moment of racist humiliation into a department-wide reckoning that would expose systemic bias at every level of law enforcement and destroy the careers of officers who thought their prejudices were protected by their badges. Rodriguez found his voice first, though it shook with the weight of his desperation. "Captain Williams, sir, we were just following standard protocol for suspicious vehicle stops. We would have treated anyone the same way under these circumstances." Marcus looked at Rodriguez with the same lack of sympathy that they had shown him just minutes earlier. "Officer Rodriguez, do you really want to stand there and tell me that you routinely pull over well-dressed professionals, driving legally in their own neighborhoods, and subject them to humiliating searches based on nothing more than the color of their skin and the kind of car they drive?" Sullivan tried to salvage the situation with an explanation that only made things worse. "Captain, we didn't know who you were. If you had identified yourself immediately, none of this would have happened." "Officer Sullivan," Marcus replied, "the fact that you didn't know who I was is exactly the problem. You made assumptions about who I was and what I was doing based solely on my appearance. And those assumptions led you to violate my constitutional rights and treat me like a criminal. The question isn't whether you knew I was a police captain. The question is why you thought it was appropriate to treat anyone this way." Both officers were now visibly sweating despite the cool night air, and Marcus could see them beginning to understand the full scope of what they had done. They had not only humiliated their commanding officer, but had also provided him with a perfect example of exactly the kind of discriminatory policing that he had been working to eliminate. "What happens now, sir?" Rodriguez asked, clearly hoping for some indication that their careers might survive this catastrophic mistake. Marcus's response was measured but final. What happens now is that you're going to experience what accountability looks like when police officers allow their biases and prejudices to override their professional judgment and constitutional obligation. This incident will be fully investigated, documented, and used as a training example for every officer in this department. Sullivan made one last desperate attempt to minimize the damage. Captain Williams, surely there's some way to resolve this without destroying our career. We've both been good officers with clean records, and this was just a misunderstanding. Marcus looked at both officers with an expression that was professional, but offered no mercy. Officers, this wasn't a misunderstanding. This was a clear pattern of racial profiling, illegal search and seizure, and discriminatory enforcement that violated everything this department is supposed to stand for. You had 20 minutes to demonstrate professional behavior, and instead you chose to demonstrate exactly why we need comprehensive reform of police training and oversight. As Marcus prepared to get back into his BMW, he wanted to make sure both officers understood the full implications of their actions. Your body cameras captured everything that happened tonight. That footage will be reviewed by Internal Affairs, the District Attorney's Office, and civil rights investigators. Your conduct will be examined not just as a personnel matter, but as a potential civil rights violation that could result in federal charges. The mention of federal charges seemed to hit both officers like a physical blow. Sullivan's face had gone from red to gray, and Rodriguez was now openly trembling as the reality of their situation became clear. Additionally, Marcus continued, this incident will become part of a comprehensive review of traffic stop practices throughout our department. Every stop you've made in the past 2 years will be examined for patterns of discriminatory or enforcement, and if we find evidence of systematic bias, there will be additional consequences beyond this single incident. As Marcus drove away from the scene, leaving Sullivan and Rodriguez standing on the sidewalk contemplating the ruins of their law enforcement careers, he was already planning the department-wide reforms that would grow out of this encounter. The body camera footage would be used in training sessions, the incident report would become a case study in discriminatory policing, and the investigation would expose similar patterns of bias among other officers who thought their prejudices were hidden from scrutiny. Within 48 hours, both Sullivan and Rodriguez would be suspended pending investigation. Within a week, their body camera footage would be requested by news organizations and civil rights groups who were monitoring police misconduct. Within a month, both officers would resign rather than face disciplinary hearings that would have resulted in their termination and loss of pension benefits. But the real transformation would come in the department-wide changes that Marcus implemented as a result of his experience. New protocols were established for traffic stops. Bias training became mandatory for all personnel, and a citizen review board was created to examine complaints about discriminatory policing. The incident became a catalyst for the kind of comprehensive police reform that had been needed for decades, but had never been implemented because department leadership had never experienced firsthand what their officers were doing to citizens on the street. Marcus Williams would later say that being racially profiled by his own officers was simultaneously the most humiliating and most educational experience of his career. It taught him that real police reform couldn't be implemented from behind a desk, but required leaders who were willing to experience the system from the perspective of those who were most often victimized by it. The dashboard camera footage of that traffic stop would eventually be viewed by millions of people and used in police training academies across the country as an example of how quickly racial bias could destroy careers and constitutional rights. But for Marcus Williams, the most important outcome was the knowledge that his department would never again allow officers like Sullivan and Rodriguez to hide their prejudices behind badges and uniforms. Years later, when other police departments were struggling with similar issues of bias and discrimination, they would send representatives to study the reforms that had grown out of Marcus Williams's traffic stop. The incident that began as a humiliating example of racial profiling had become a model for how police departments could acknowledge their problems and implement meaningful solutions. Final rehook. The night that Captain Marcus Williams got pulled over by his own officers became a turning point not just for his department, but for law enforcement nationwide. Sometimes the most powerful reforms come from leaders who are willing to experience injustice firsthand and then use their authority to ensure it never happens again. Sullivan and Rodriguez learned that lesson too late to save their careers, but just in time to serve as an example of what happens when police officers forget that their job is to serve and protect everyone, not just the people who look like they belong in expensive cars driving through upscale neighborhoods. Thank you for watching. Please don't forget to leave a comment and subscribe. These are very important to us. Thank you.